Welcome back to the weekend. Need another reminder that the 2024 presidential race is anything but normal? Look no further than Donald Trump's social media tirade this weekend. Judges overseeing his legal cases and asking, how many corrupt judges do I have to endure before somebody steps in? Somebody steps in? We all know what happens when Donald Trump asks folks to stand back and stand by. A deadly insurrection. In fact, Trump is choosing to make January 6th a centerpiece of his campaign and defending the rioters by calling them political hostages. Joining us now to discuss it all is Joscelyn, a principal author of the January 6th Committee's final report, and NBC News presidential historian Michael Beschloss.
Welcome to you both, gentlemen. Tom, I want to start with you, and I'd like to play out of the gate sound from a conversation we had yesterday with former Capitol Hill police officer Harry Dunn. Could you take a listen just real quick?
Sure. No pushback against it equals a win for them. That's why we have to continue to speaking out and pushing it back and calling out for what it is, BS. Like, that's what it is. And you need people that are continually pushing that. As long as the counter narrative is out there, you have to have people that are out there to continue to be truth tellers about what happened that day.
To Simone's point, the counter narrative is being pushed consistently, constantly by Donald Trump. Harry Dunn is running for Congress as a former police officer on Capitol Hill who was there on January 6th, drawing that line. The work that you did on January 6th, you obviously saw and heard a lot of detail about where those lines should be drawn. How do we, as Americans, step more fully into the narrative that Harry laid out, pushing back, calling out the BS, and making sure people understand that what Donald Trump is actually doing is subtly asking for his supporters to get engaged? And we, as Simone pointed out, know how that turned out on January 6th.
Yeah, you know, Simone said it right at the outset that this is so far from normal, and that's exactly a thought that occurs to me every day studying this. When you look at the January 6th defendants, whom Trump refers to as hostages and political prisoners, this rhetoric is so far outside the bounds of our normal politics that we have to address it as such, right? He doesn't see himself as a political candidate vying for the presidency who wants to run the U.S. government. He sees himself as an insurgent who wants to overthrow the U.S. government. And that's what a lot of his people believe, too. When you look at the crowd being held in D.C., for example, a lot of them have anti-government extremist beliefs. They don't believe that the U.S. government is legitimate. They do not believe that the U.S. government really is a sovereign entity that should be respected. And Trump is directly playing into that by calling these people hostages, a word that's usually used in armed conflict between two sides, right? He's completely outside the bounds of our political normalcy. And
here's the thing that we all know well, Michael Beschloss, which is it's not just Donald Trump. It is also elected officials, people with real power who are carrying his water. I want you to take a listen to something Speaker Mike Johnson had to say this past week on Newsmax.
I made a commitment immediately after I got the gavel that we would start releasing that. Originally, we were trying to blur some of the faces to protect the innocent, you know, people who were just there and just happened to be walking through the building.
To protect the innocent, you know, people who were there and just happened to be walking through the building, Michael Beschloss. My question to you is, what happens to a society where you have a large swath of people who believe a lie about that place's own history?
Well, you know, the place that starts, Alicia, is that there's a tradition in this country and actually a requirement that goes way back. When an aspiring new citizen came to this country, they would be asked a question by a federal official. And what was the question? The question was, do you advocate the overthrow of the government of the United States by force or violence? That was a threshold demand just to become a citizen. Now we've got the Speaker of the House saying that this was okay, President of the United States saying, or ex-president, an aspiring next president, saying that what happened on January 6th was something to be praised, that these are hostages, these are prisoners. We're living in a world that is upside down. And unfortunately, there is now a large media sphere that will let them get away with this lie. And if they do, our society does not have too much future, because the most elemental thing that all of us as citizens have the right to depend on is that our government protects us against the threat of a group going into the Capitol, attacking the Congress, and possibly, as some tried that day, killing leaders of Congress, including the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, and other officials.
We should note that, well, Alicia, to your point, that you put, I mean, the tours were closed that day. Tours were closed during the time of on January 6th because of COVID. So there were no random people walking through the building. And Mike Johnson was one of the chief cheerleaders of the insurrection, of Donald Trump's big lie, and spoke to him regularly. Like,
right. I was interrupting you, Simone, because Tom really wanted to jump in after he heard that sound from Speaker Johnson. Go ahead, Tom.
Well, you know, look, I've looked at a lot of the January 6th security footage, right? The committee looked at a lot of it. Release it, Speaker Johnson. Release all of it, right? It's not going to validate your conspiracy theories. It's not going to validate what the hard right wants to believe. In fact, I would be glad to walk people through what that security footage actually shows, which are that far-right extremists led the attack at every point they could on that day. And a lot of the people who walked through the Capitol were not there, obviously, peacefully. A lot of people who were there who have been charged were quite violent. And in fact, a lot of the defendants who Donald Trump praises as hostages and political prisoners and advocates for their cause have been charged with attacking cops, right? This is not some peaceful tourist visit, as Speaker Johnson would have you believe.
You know, not only then is this not normal, this is also very, very, very dangerous. Yes. And a court filing from a U.S. district judge, Royce Lamberth, and this was filed on Wednesday, and this does not happen. Violence, it says violence risks begetting a vicious cycle that could threaten cherished conventions and imperil our very institutions of government. And that sense political violence rots republics. This cannot become normal. We as a community, we as a society, we as a country cannot condone the normalization of the January 6th Capitol riot. Judge Lamberth was a Reagan appointee. He served as a judge in D.C. January 6th trial. Just Michael Beschloss, the words, the fact that he has to write this. People can have been attempted to be harmed by Donald Trump's rhetoric. People have died because of what he has called on people to do. There are not two sides to this.
No, there aren't. And the other thing is that we're not just debating what happened 4 years ago, as important as that was. There's going to be an election this November. And if Donald Trump loses, or maybe if he wins, what this kind of rhetoric does is to say to people, if he loses after the election day, go into the streets, go after your governors, protest to state legislatures. And then when the ballots are counted in early January of 2025 in Congress, if we get that far, may God help us to do that. January 6th was great. Why don't we do it again, but this time succeed? Look at the number of people around Trump who have said the problem with January 6th was not that this attack was tried, that this effort to overthrow the ballots, but that it didn't succeed. Next time, they say they have to do better.
Tom, as is so often the case, Michael Beschloss got to my point before I did, which is when Donald Trump is saying this, it's not just... I'm channeling you, Michael Beschloss. He's not just like trying new talking points. He's trying to create a permission structure, right? He's trying to both sort of carry the lie through about what happened on January 6th and in the lead up to January 6th, but he's also trying to create a future permission structure so that it can happen again.
I mean, that's exactly right. He's already created a permission structure in which the U.S. government is illegitimate in the eyes of most of his followers, many of his followers anyway. Just think about that, right? This isn't a guy who's running for be president to run the U.S. government. This is a guy who's running on a platform that says the U.S. government is illegitimate and implicitly deserves to be overthrown, right? A lot of these people who attacked the Capitol on January 6th believe that. They believe that the government was illegitimate, that the election was stolen. They believe Trump's lies, and these lies are corrosive to the very foundation of our democracy.
So do me a favor, though. Connect that to me with Trump saying he'll be a dictator on day one.
Well, I mean, just the fact that he's willing to go that far and say he'd be a dictator on day one, who's going to trust him on day two, right? I mean, this is completely abnormal in the history of our politics, right? The dictator word used to be out of bounds, used to be off limits. We used to understand that America was founded on overthrowing a dictatorship and saying that we're not going to, abide by the rulings of some distant monarch, right? This is what January 6th is really all about. His followers believed that they were fighting for the new 1776, the Second American Revolution. It's completely the opposite. They were on the side of the new King George. And the new King George is out there portraying himself as this freedom fighter when it's, again, exactly the opposite. He wants to take away the freedoms of the American people. He wants a rule of one, not a rule of by democracy.
So, Michael, I want to pick up on Tom's point because I think it's a very important one and a very powerful one to make because I hear what my friend is saying, but out here on the streets of America, we were just talking with the Secretary of Labor, right? 51% of the American people think Donald Trump did a better job than the current president on the economy, the Middle East, I'll just go through the list of stuff. So what is it? Where's their historical nexus that we can look to see how people process information like this? I mean, it's just as stark as this is, to the point that they actually will elect a person who's telling them, I'm going to be a dictator. And they're like, OK, let's do that.
Well, look what's happened in the last 30 years. You know, people feel that we can just spend endlessly trillions of dollars and borrow them, and it's never going to have an effect. Or in 2004, as you both remember, a lot of people told pollsters at the time that George W. Bush was running against John Kerry that they thought Saddam Hussein was behind 9/11. When Barack Obama was president, the number of people who told pollsters, we think he's a secret Muslim, which great if he was, but he wasn't. So the point is that in the society that we're living in, a big lie can get around the world in a way that it probably could not before an internet gave some crazy person access to billions of followers, and that also goes for certain cable channels. And the other thing that I'm worried about is this, is that one of the most dangerous things I've heard in the last few weeks was, do you remember when Donald Trump said, I don't need the Nikki Haley voters?
Yes.
What that says to me is that in his mind, and I'm just speculating here, maybe he's already dealing with a situation in his brain where, you know, it's not necessary to win the most electoral votes in November, as one member of the Trump entourage is quoted as having said before January 6th, let's go straight to the violence. That quote from him, not from me, obviously.
Our institutions are only as strong as the people who support them, who lead them. Yeah. Our democracy is only as strong as the people who are willing to fight for its preservation. And Tom, I am so concerned. I know we have all these conversations about how Democrats can't scare people to the polls. I am scared.
Let me help you out.
I am scared.
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't think that the threat that Trump poses is really being taken seriously enough by some people. You know, I think that there are a lot of people who have their heads in the sand. You know, Liz Cheney, who I've worked for and known for 20 years, recently said that she warned that we may be sleepwalking into a dictatorship. I think there are a lot of people who are sleepwalking. They're not paying attention. That, you know, when it comes to the debate about whether or not Trump is an autocrat or not, this is silly. Of course he's an autocrat. He literally puts the auto in autocrat. It's about one guy, you know, and his own vice president was out of bounds because he wouldn't shred the Constitution for him on January 6th. So that should be, we've had all the warning signs we need, right? It's just time for people to wake up and understand this is not a normal, as you would say, Simone, this is not a normal political candidate vying for the presidency. This is somebody who's trying to overthrow our government and our institutions.
Hey everyone, MSNBC has a new and improved app. You'll get real-time alerts and analysis, live blogs, in-depth essays, video highlights, and the best 2024 election coverage. Download the new MSNBC app. Here's how to do it. You tap on the App Store on your phone. You hit search on the bottom right corner. You type in MSNBC. You click on the MSNBC app. You click on Get or the cloud icon and enjoy it.